Hello everyone, I'm Shahd Mutaz, currently a year 3 student, and today we're going to be talking all about basal ganglia. So first we're going to start with a quick anatomy review, then we're going to talk about the direct versus indirect pathway, and finally we're going to be talking about the clinical correlation between Huntington's and Parkinson's disease. So first let's start with anatomy. So over here I have a cross section of the brain, and this is the lateral ventricle. Next to it we have the caudate nucleus, which is our first basal nuclei. And as we know, all of the basal ganglia are involved in coordination of movements, making sure that all of the movements that we want to do are carried out nicely without any unwanted movements. So the caudate nucleus is the first basal ganglia. Under it we have the thalamus over here, and laterally we have the putamen. So the putamen is over here on both sides, and medially to the putamen we have what is known as the globus pallidus. The globus pallidus has two parts. It has the interna and the externa. The interna is involved in the direct pathway, while the externa is involved in the indirect pathway. And over here we have what's called the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra also has two parts. We have the pars compacta and the pars reticulata. For today, we're mostly having an emphasis on the pars compacta as it's involved in both the direct and indirect pathway. How so? It essentially is involved in the production of dopamine, and it sends it to the striatum. Now you're going to ask me, what is the striatum? The striatum is basically the caudate nucleus and the putamen referred together as the striatum. Very important, make sure you memorize. Finally, we have the subthalamic nucleus, which is situated over here above the substantia nigra. Tamam. Now that we're done with anatomy, we're going to move on to physio. So for physio, just like we discussed, we have the direct versus indirect pathway. Before talking about each pathway, we first need to get down what is the function or what is the primary objective of each pathway. So, the direct pathway's final destination or final objective is to increase movement, while the indirect pathway's final objective is to decrease movement or inhibit unnecessary or unwanted movement. And the way that each of them do that is very different. So, first let's talk about the direct pathway. But before we talk about that, I want to just quickly bring something to your attention. It is that the thalamus, which is essentially almost the final destination for both pathways, the thalamus is forever under what is called as tonic inhibition. Why? Because the thalamus, it receives input from a lot of areas, and in order to prevent unwanted movement, we always have to keep the thalamus at a specific threshold. So you can imagine like these dogs, okay, and you're holding them with a leash. If, la samahallah, one of these dogs like gets out, you're going to end up with unnecessary movement, which is why you have to tightly hold all of your dogs, right? So you have to constantly keep the thalamus under tonic inhibition, which is why you can notice that in both pathways, over here in the indirect and direct pathway, the thalamus is receiving inhibitory input. No matter what is happening here or no matter what is happening here, the final thing that is happening is GABA is being released to the thalamus. But what's different is that the level of GABA. In the direct pathway, GABA, and as we obviously know, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, while glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So as I was just saying, the difference between the final destination of both is simply the level of GABA. Okay, so in the indirect pathway, in the direct pathway, the level of GABA is a lot less, which means that you're going to have more activation of the thalamus. While in the indirect pathway, the level of GABA is a lot more. That means that you're going to inhibit the thalamus, therefore inhibiting movement. Okay? So I like to talk about the final destination before talking about the specifics, just so that we're oriented. Now let's talk about the specifics of each. So as we just mentioned, the direct pathway, مثل ما حكينا again, is to increase movement. So how are we going to do that? Tamam, let's start with the association cortex. So let's say I want to lift a cup. My association cortex is going to start planning this movement before I actually do it. So it's going to send glutamate, also known as an excitatory neurotransmitter, to the striatum. And we just agreed that the striatum is what? The caudate nucleus and the putamen. caudate nucleus and the putamen, okay? So it's going to send excitatory signals to the striatum via glutamate. On the other hand, we also have the substantia nigra, specifically the pars compacta, which is what we talked about over here. We said that it's involved in the direct and indirect pathway. How? By secreting dopamine, and it sends it to the striatum. So over here, as you can see, pars compacta releases dopamine and sends it to the striatum. طيب, هلا, pay attention to the receptor over here. In the direct pathway, we are using a D1 receptor. This D1 receptor is activating or stimulating or excitatory. Tamam. We also need to jot down a very, very important fact. It is that the striatum is inhibitory in nature. What does that mean? Anything that releases GABA or substance P or enkephalin is inhibitory in nature, obviously, because it's secreting GABA, so it's going to inhibit whatever is after it. That's what we mean by inhibitory in nature. But think with me here. If you are exciting something that is inhibitory, does that mean that the final result will be inhibition or excitation? It's going to be inhibition. Why? Because if I am exciting something that's going to secrete GABA, that means it's going to secrete a lot of GABA, a lot more GABA. So what's after it is going to be inhibited. This is exactly what's happening over here. You're getting glutamate and dopamine from both of these structures, and they're going to the striatum, which is inhibitory. So it's going to secrete a lot of GABA, and it's going to inhibit the next structure, which is the globus pallidus internus. And we just said that the globus pallidus internus is involved in the direct pathway. وصلت؟ تمام. هلا, what's next? This globus pallidus internus is also inhibitory in nature. Why? Because it's secreting GABA. Makes sense. صح? But just like we just said, the level of GABA is what determines the outcome in both pathways. Over here, I need to excite the thalamus. Why? Because I want movement. The goal of this pathway is to promote movement. But how am I going to make sure that the level of GABA in the direct pathway is less? It's simply by inhibiting this. How are we going to inhibit this? By secreting GABA from the striatum. How are we going to make sure that we're getting a lot of GABA? By making sure that this is excited. By making sure that the striatum is excited. So again, the striatum, which is inhibitory in nature, is secreting GABA to the globus pallidus internus. Now, this is very inhibited, meaning that it will secrete less GABA. يعني بالحالتين, if it's excited or if it's inhibited, it will secrete GABA. So my primary goal over here is to simply control the level of GABA. Okay? I'm going to control the level of GABA, making sure it's a lot less, making sure that the thalamus is disinhibited. Because remember, we just said that the thalamus is under tonic inhibition. So I need to disinhibit, okay, the thalamus. How? By secreting less GABA than normal. What's my primary goal? Increase movement. The thalamus is going to go to the premotor cortex and initiate movement. Okay, which makes sense that the direct pathway is involved in exercise and it's for desired movement. Now let's talk about the indirect pathway. Now the goal of the indirect pathway is to prevent movement, but it's not to completely inhibit movement. It's simply to prevent unnecessary movement, okay? It's important to keep that in mind. So within the indirect pathway, we actually have another separate pathway related to the D2 receptor, and I'm going to make it clear in a bit, but first let's discuss the original indirect pathway. So as we know, we're going to get information from the association cortex, and it's going to activate the striatum, which is inhibitory. This means that you're going to get a lot of GABA, which is going to reach the globus pallidus external segment, because as we previously mentioned, the externa is involved in the indirect pathway, while the interna is involved in the direct pathway. So the globus pallidus externus is going to receive a lot of GABA, meaning that it's going to be inhibited, right? It's going to be inhibited. So this means that it's going to secrete less GABA to the subthalamic nucleus. This means that the subthalamic nucleus right now is activated, meaning that it will secrete a lot of glutamate. Okay? It's going to secrete glutamate and send it to the globus pallidus internus. And this is where the globus pallidus internus, which is secreting GABA, is activated by glutamate, meaning that it will secrete a lot of GABA. So by secreting a lot of GABA, we are therefore inhibiting the thalamus. Contrary to what was happening over here, you had less GABA reaching the thalamus, so you had less inhibition of the thalamus, known as disinhibition. But over here, you are inhibiting the thalamus by activating the inhibitory signal, which is from the globus pallidus internus. It is going to secrete a lot of GABA and it's going to inhibit the thalamus. But as we know, we do not want to completely halt movement. That's going to be very confusing to the body. Like, am I moving or am I not moving? Because the indirect and direct pathway have to work in harmony. The goal is to simply prevent unwanted movement, right? So how am I going to prevent complete disinhibition of movement? This is where the role of the D2 receptors come into play. So essentially what's happening is that you have the pars compacta, as we mentioned, not the reticulata, the compacta. It's going to release dopamine. The dopamine in the indirect pathway is going to attach to the D2 receptors on the striatum, sorry. So on the striatum, you have those D2 receptors, and opposite to what the association cortex was doing, which was activating the striatum, over here, the D2 receptors or the dopamine is inhibiting the striatum. And as we agreed before, if you are inhibiting something that is already inhibitory, this means that you're going to have less inhibition, right? That means that you're going to have low GABA secreted under the influence of D2. Opposite of from the association cortex, we had activating, so you had high GABA, okay? So this is high GABA under the influence of association cortex, but slow GABA under the influence of the dopamine from the D2 receptor. So, and I also want you to understand that these two are happening simultaneously. So there's a constant balance between the two. I know that they are complete opposites, but it's a balance, simply to prevent complete disinhibition from the indirect pathway, because we still want to promote movement, but we are simply, what are we doing over here? We are preventing undesired movement, all right? So again, let's continue the D2 pathway. So we're going to have low GABA secreted from the caudate, the striatum. This means that the externus is going to be disinhibited, meaning that it's not going to be as inhibited as it usually was under the influence of the association cortex. So it's going to secrete a lot of GABA. So this GABA is going to therefore inhibit the subthalamic nucleus, okay? So it's inhibited over here. That means that it's not going to secrete as much glutamate. And this means that the globus pallidus internus is going to be it's not going to be as activated. But under the influence of the association cortex, it was highly activated, secreting a lot of GABA, okay? But under the influence of the D2 receptor, it's not going to be that activated. So we have some balance, we have harmony. So it's not going to secrete way too much GABA to the point where we are going to completely inhibit the thalamus. It's going to balance it out. We're going to reach that sweet spot where you're not completely activating the thalamus like you were in the direct pathway, and you're not completely inhibiting it like you would if you just had the indirect pathway on its own without the influence of the D2 receptor. So you're going to get glutamate secreted to the globus pallidus, but it's not as much. Therefore, you're going to get a lesser amount of GABA being secreted. The overall result, the end result, is simply preventing unnecessary movement. This is why you have prevention of absolute inhibition. So if you get a question saying what prevents absolute inhibition of movement, you would say the D2 pathway, the dopamine that is secreted from the pars compacta. Now let's talk about the clinical correlation. So we're going to start with Huntington's, okay? So all of the purple writing that you can see is for Huntington's, and all of the red writing that you can see in the pathway is for Parkinson's. So let's start شوي بهuntington's. So for Huntington, we have the striatum and globus pallidus external pathway. It's going to be disrupted. Basically, what happens is that the globus pallidus externus is no longer going to be properly inhibited by the striatum, meaning that the striatum will release less GABA, meaning that it will become overexcited. يعني هاي ما رح توصلها a lot of GABA. The external segment ما رح يوصلها a lot of GABA. Instead, رح يوصلها شوية GABA. So that means that it's not being inhibited anymore, it's being excited. And if you're exciting something that's inhibitory in nature, this means it's going to secrete a lot of GABA to the subthalamic nucleus. So the subthalamic nucleus is in Huntington is going to be over-inhibited. ليش? Because this is overexcited. So if this is over-inhibited, this means that it is going to secrete less glutamate. If the globus pallidus internal segment is receiving less glutamate, that means that it will secrete less GABA, صح? Because I'm inhibiting it now. So if I'm inhibiting something that's inhibitory, I'm not going to get GABA. حيكون كتير قليل GABA. So the globus pallidus internal segment is underexcited in Huntington's, leading to less GABA, leading to less inhibition of the thalamus, leading to increased motor activity. Basically, we're mimicking the direct pathway حاليا, if you think about it. So if you have increased motor activity in the thalamus when you're not supposed to, this is known as hyperkinesia. And this is going to manifest in Huntington's as chorea. So you're going to get a lot of unwanted movement, and this is what we call as hyperkinesia. And to remember it quickly, if it came in an MCQ and you don't really want to think, just think Huntington, if someone is hunting, that means they're running, they're becoming active, صح? It's hyperkinesia, because in Parkinson's, you have hypokinesia, and you can just think, you're parking your car, so it's not moving, so obviously hypo. Okay, so I hope that makes sense for Huntington's. Now let's talk about Parkinson's. It's essentially the opposite. Now in Parkinson's, you have a degeneration of dopaminergic neurons, which is going to lead to a lack of dopamine. And as we know, dopamine is involved in the indirect pathway by attaching to the D2 receptors on the striatum. And as we know also, they are inhibitory in nature, meaning that the striatum, under the influence of the D2 receptors, it's supposed to become less inhibitory, صح? يعني it's supposed to release less GABA. But in this case, what's happening? If you have no dopamine at all, that means that your striatum is going to be highly active, صح? It's going to be highly active. So what is that going to cause? It's going to cause increased inhibition by increased GABA secretion. It's going to cause increased inhibition of the globus pallidus externus. So as you can see, the globus pallidus externus is going to be over-inhibited in Parkinson's, leading to less GABA secretion by the globus pallidus externus, leading to an overactive subthalamic nucleus. So if this is overactive, that means it's going to secrete more glutamate, and this means that this is going to secrete more GABA. So if it's secreting a lot of GABA, that means that you are inhibiting the thalamus, which is where the term hypokinesia comes from. This means that you're going to get rigidity and a resting tremor. So in this case, the indirect pathway is becoming more active in the case of Parkinson's. ولكن in the case of Huntington's, the indirect pathway started behaving like the direct pathway. So I hope this makes sense. Please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to contact me. And yeah, استودعتكم الله.